About 25 years ago, in the Himalayan foothills of present day Nepal, there lived a great place, a king who was going to have a son. For this son, the king had a particularly grand idea. He would make the child's life perfect. The child would never know a moment of suffering, every need, every desire would be accounted for at all times. The king built high walls around the places that prevented the prince from knowing the outside world. He spoiled the child, lavishing him with food and gifts, surrounding him with servants who created and catered to his every whim. And just as planned, the child grew up ignorant of routine, cruelty, and human existence. All of the prince's childhood went on like this, but despite the endless luxury and opulence, the prince became kind of piece of a young man. Soon every experience felt empty and valueless. The problem was that no matter what his father gave him, it never seemed enough, never meant anything. So late one night, the prince struck out of the place to see what was beyond its walls. He had a servant drive him through the local village, and that what he saw horrified him. For the first time in his life, the prince saw human suffering. He saw sick people, old people, homeless people, people in pain, even people dying. The prince returned to the place and found himself in a short existential crisis, not knowing how to process what he'd seen. He got all info about everything and complained a lot and is not typical of a young man. The prince ended up blaming his father for the very things his father had tried to do for him. It was the riches the princess thought that had made him so miserable, that had made life seem so meaningless. He decided to run away, but the princess was more like his father than he knew. He had a grand idea, so he wouldn't just run away. He would give up his royalty, his family, and all of his possessions and live in the streets, sleeping in dirt like animals. There he would starve himself, torture himself, and beg for scraps for food from strangers from the rest of his life. Next night, he the princess struck out of the place again. The time never to return. For years, he lived as a bum, a discarded and forgotten remnant of society. The gods had kept the button of the social tolerant people, and as planned, the princess suffered greatly. He suffered through disease, hunger, pain, and loneliness and decay. He confronted the brink of the death itself, often limited to eating single nut each day. A few years went by, then a few more, and then nothing happened. The princess began to notice that life is of suffering wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. It wasn't bringing him the insight he had desired. It wasn't revealing any deeper mystery of the world or its ultimate purpose. In that fact, Prince came to know what the rest of us always kind of unknown, that suffering totally sucks, and it is not necessarily that meaningful either. As with begin, there is no value in suffering when it's done without purpose. And soon the prince came to the conclusion that his grand idea, like his father, was in fact the fucking terrible idea that should probably go to something else instead. Totally confused, the prince cleaned himself up and went about a big tree near a river. He decided that he would sit under the tree and never get up until he came up with another grand idea. As the legend goes, the confused prince sat under that tree for the 49 days, and we won't delve into the biological validity and sitting in the same spot for the 49 days. But let's just say that in the time that prince came to a number of profound realization. One of those realization was this, that life itself is a form of suffering. The rich suffer because of their riches, the poor suffer because of their poverty. People without a family suffer because of they have no family. People with a family suffer because of their family. People who pursue worldly pleasure suffer because of their worldly pleasure. And people who obtain and from worldly pleasure suffer because of their abstention. This isn't say that all suffering is equal. Some suffering is certainly more painful than other, but we all must suffer nonetheless. And years later, the prince would build his own philosophy and share it with the world. And this would be its the first central tenet, that pain and losses are the inevitable, and we should let go of trying resist them. The princess and the would later become known as the Buddha. And in case you haven't heard of him, he was kind of big deal. There is a premise that underlines a lot of assumptions, and beliefs. The premise is that happiness is algorithmic, that it can be worked for and earned and achieved as if we were getting accepted to law school or building a really complicated let's go. If achieve 10, then can I happy? If I look like why there, I can be happy. If I can be a person like said and they can be happy. This premise through is the problem. Happiness is not a soluble question. Dissatisfaction and unease are inherent parts of the human nature, and as we will necessarily component to creating consistent happiness, the Buddha argued from the theological and the philosophical perspective. I will make the same argument in this chapter, but I will make it from a biological perspective and with the pandas.